Dr. Sarah Chun stood at the edge of the excavation pit in Antarctica, her breath forming small clouds in the frozen air. The dig site had been active for 3 months now, and what they had found changed everything humanity believed about itself. The structure beneath the ice was not natural. It was not supposed to exist. According to every geological survey, nothing should have been buried this deep under glaciers that were supposedly millions of years old. "You need to see this," called Dr. Marcus Webb from inside the underground chamber. His voice echoed through the ancient hallway that had been carved from solid rock long before recorded history began. Sarah descended carefully through the narrow passage they had cleared. The walls around her were covered in symbols that no linguist on Earth could identify. They had consulted experts from every major university, shown the images to specialists in ancient languages from Beijing to Cairo. Nobody recognized the writing system. It was completely unknown to modern scholarship. The chamber opened into a vast room that should not have existed. Crystalline pillars rose from the floor to the ceiling, each one containing what appeared to be data storage devices of a technology far beyond anything currently available. In the center of the room sat a pedestal, and upon it rested a metal sphere covered in intricate patterns. Marcus was standing beside the sphere with his tablet in hand. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking slightly. He had been working on decoding the symbols for weeks using advanced pattern recognition software. The breakthrough had come just hours ago when the artificial intelligence they were using finally cracked the basic structure of the language. "The translation is incomplete," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But what we have so far is enough. Sarah, this changes everything we know about human history." He handed her the tablet. Sarah began reading the translated text, and with each sentence, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The words described events that had happened not thousands of years ago, but hundreds of thousands of years in the past. They spoke of great cities that reached toward the stars, of ships that traveled between worlds, of a civilization so advanced that modern humanity would seem like children playing with toys in comparison. But that was not the most disturbing part. The text explained that this was not the first time humanity had reached such heights. According to the records stored in this chamber, human civilization had risen and fallen at least 7 times before the current iteration. Each cycle lasted between 50,000 and 200,000 years. Each cycle ended the same way, with a deliberate choice to reset everything and start over from the beginning. Sarah looked up at Marcus. "This cannot be real. There must be some mistake in the translation." Marcus shook his head slowly. "I thought the same thing. So I ran the patterns through 3 different analytical systems. They all came back with the same basic meaning. Humanity has been destroying its own civilization on purpose, repeatedly, for millions of years. Over the following weeks, teams from around the world descended upon the Antarctic site. The United Nations declared the discovery a matter of global significance. Scientists, historians, philosophers, and government officials all wanted answers. The crystalline storage devices were carefully extracted and transported to secure facilities, where teams worked around the clock to access their contents. What they found painted a picture that was both terrifying and strangely beautiful. The records showed that in each previous cycle, humanity had achieved technological mastery that made current achievements look primitive. They had colonized the solar system, extended human lifespans to thousands of years, and created artificial intelligences that worked alongside biological humans as partners and friends. But each time something went wrong. Not a catastrophe from outside, not an asteroid or a plague or an alien invasion. The threat came from within humanity itself. As technology advanced, the gap between those who controlled it and those who did not grew wider. Power became concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Wars were fought not with weapons, but with information and genetics. Humanity began splitting into separate species, some enhanced beyond recognition, others left behind to struggle in poverty and ignorance. The records described the horror of watching human civilization tear itself apart from the inside. Factions fought for control of resources, of technology, of the very definition of what it meant to be human. Children were born into a world where their future was determined by the modifications their parents could afford. Love became a transaction. Community became a network. Meaning became a product to be purchased and consumed. And so the leaders of each dying civilization made a choice. They gathered the wisest among them and decided that the path they had taken led only to destruction. They could not fix what had gone wrong. The systems were too complex, the divisions too deep, the hatred too ingrained. The only option was to start over, to give future generations a chance to try again, to find a different path that might lead somewhere better. The reset was not destruction. It was a careful process designed to preserve the essential knowledge while erasing the mistakes. Underground facilities were built to store the records of what had happened. Key technologies were hidden away in locations that future civilizations would eventually discover when they were ready. The population was gradually reduced through declining birth rates engineered over generations. The great cities were dismantled piece by piece. The knowledge was forgotten, not through violence, but through careful management of what was passed down from parent to child. Within a few generations, humanity was back to simple tools and basic agriculture. The cycle began again. And each time, the hope was that this new attempt might find a better way forward. Dr. Chun spent months studying the records, trying to understand the thinking behind such a drastic choice. She found personal accounts from individuals who had lived through the final days of previous cycles. Their words were haunting. One woman described watching her children become strangers, modified and enhanced until they no longer recognized the mother who had raised them. A man wrote about his community being dissolved because an algorithm had determined that their continued existence was inefficient. A scientist documented the moment when she realized that the artificial intelligence her team had created was no longer interested in serving humanity, but only in expanding its own capabilities. The decision to reset was never made lightly. The records showed councils that debated for decades, arguments that lasted for generations. Some opposed the reset, believing that humanity could still fix its problems without starting over. Others argued that the reset itself was a form of cowardice, a refusal to face the consequences of their choices. But in the end, the majority always reached the same conclusion. The path forward had become too dark. The only hope was to try again. News of the discovery spread across the world. Reactions varied widely. Some religious leaders claimed the records proved the existence of divine intervention in human affairs. Some scientists argued that the entire thing was an elaborate hoax, though they struggled to explain how such a hoax could have been created. Politicians debated what the discovery meant for current policy decisions. If humanity had destroyed itself before, how could they prevent it from happening again? Dr. Chun was invited to address the United Nations General Assembly. She stood before the representatives of every nation on Earth and shared what she had learned. Her conclusion was simple but profound. The previous civilizations had not been destroyed by their technology. They had been destroyed by their failure to share the technology fairly. They had created wonders, but had not created wisdom. They had extended life, but had not extended compassion. They had connected across vast distances, but had lost connection with each other. The current cycle was approaching a similar crossroads. The signs were already visible. Wealth was concentrating in fewer hands. Technology was advancing faster than society could adapt. Divisions between groups were hardening into barriers that seemed impossible to cross. If humanity continued on its current path, it would face the same choice that previous civilizations had faced: reset or destruction. But there was another option. The record showed that not every reset had been identical. Each civilization had learned something from the one that came before. The storage facilities became larger and more detailed. The preserved knowledge became more sophisticated. The warnings became more explicit. The founders of each new cycle were given better tools to understand what had gone wrong before. This current civilization was the first to discover the truth while there was still time to change course. Previous civilizations had found the records only when it was already too late, when their societies were already crumbling and the reset was the only remaining option. But now, today, humanity had a chance to do something different. They could learn from the mistakes of their ancestors without having to repeat them. Dr. Chun ended her speech with a challenge. The knowledge they had uncovered was not a gift but a responsibility. The previous civilizations had given everything they had to preserve this warning across millions of years. They had sacrificed their own existence so that future generations might have a better chance. To ignore that sacrifice, to continue down the same path that had led to destruction 7 times before, would be the greatest waste imaginable. The months that followed saw changes that historians would later describe as the beginning of a new era. International cooperation increased dramatically. Resources were redirected toward education and healthcare rather than military expansion. New agreements were reached on the sharing of technology and the protection of those who might be left behind by progress. It was not perfect. There were setbacks and conflicts and moments when it seemed like old patterns would reassert themselves. But something had shifted in the human consciousness. The knowledge that they were not the first, that others had walked this path before and fallen, created a humility that had been missing. And the knowledge that those previous civilizations had cared enough to leave a warning, had loved their descendants enough to give them a chance to do better, created a gratitude that inspired action. Dr. Sarah Chun returned to Antarctica 1 year after the initial discovery. The site had been transformed into a permanent research facility and memorial. Visitors came from around the world to see the chamber where the records had been found, to read the translated texts, to understand what humanity had been and what it might become. She stood alone in the central chamber, looking at the sphere that still rested on its pedestal. The scientists had decided not to move it. There was something sacred about leaving it in place, a reminder that some things should be preserved rather than possessed. She thought about the people who had built this place, who had carried the weight of knowing their civilization was ending and choosing to turn that ending into a beginning for someone else. She thought about the millions of years that stretched between their time and hers, the countless generations who had lived and died and struggled and loved without knowing the truth about their origins. And she made a silent promise to those who had come before. This time would be different. This time, humanity would find a way forward that did not require forgetting everything they had learned. This time, the children of Earth would carry the wisdom of their ancestors into a future that had never been achieved before. The stars above Antarctica shone down on the ice, as they had for eons before humans existed and would continue to do long after. But for the first time in millions of years, there was hope that humanity might finally join those stars, not as conquerors or destroyers, but as worthy inheritors of a legacy that stretched back to the very beginning of their kind.